You might think that a talk about the role of women in public life in the Middle Ages would be an extremely short one. After all, there is no medieval queen. No woman is on the throne in her own right until the 16th century. And to most historians, the 16th century is way beyond the medieval. Women couldn't be ordained as priests in the church. They could not command armies. They could not witness documents. If they held public office by virtue of their estates, then they tended not to exercise that office in person. A married woman could not make a will without her husband's consent. Provision of education tended to favour men rather than women. Where schools were founded, they were generally for boys, and it would be pretty much unheard of for a woman to attend such a thing as a university. So without picking out wholly exceptional women, such as Nicolea de la Haye, who defended Lincoln Castle by herself in the early 13th century, or Margaret Beaufort, who was the mastermind behind Henry Tudor's invasion of England in 1485. It's very difficult to make a case that women had a conventional and domineering role in public life. They did not. But while it's impossible to find an example of a queen who ruled in her own right, that isn't to say that medieval queens didn't have an important public role to play. First of all, the very fact of their marriage was a crucial diplomatic tool, enabling the avoidance of war or the termination of existing ones. Once queen, or once married to the king, the queen's production of an heir was crucial in securing the dynasty. And having done that, the role of the queen in influencing the king could often be greater. That very idea of being able to influence what the king did was crucial to the understanding of the role of the medieval queen. She was supposed, however, to influence the king to the good, enabling him to show acts of mercy or to be flexible in the application of justice. I think that the queen who best exemplifies how that role was supposed to be exercised was Philippa of Hainault. She was the wife of King Edward III. And throughout her very long period as queen, there are examples of where she influences the king to the good. Once in 1331, she was attending a tournament, and she and her ladies-in-waiting were on a scaffold or a stand that was erected to enable them to watch this tournament. Unfortunately, the carpenters who had built the stand had not done so very well. But the Queen, having narrowly escaped a dreadful fate and accident, went to the king and begged for mercy on behalf of the carpenters who had built the poor scaffolding. Later, in 1347, at the siege of Calais, this is a very famous incident recounted by a contemporary chronicler. The Queen intervened, heavily pregnant, on behalf of the burghers of Calais, who had failed to succumb as quickly as the king was expecting to the siege situation. And the Queen intervened and persuaded her husband not to execute the burghers of Calais. Later on, she intervened on behalf of a pregnant woman who was accused of stealing and enabled her to avoid the fate of being hanged for her crime. In the second area of life, as I mentioned at the start, women couldn't be ordained as priests, but that did not prevent them from entering the church and having a life, a career in their own right. Women, particularly noble women and women of the gentry class, but those below as well, would sometimes enter a nunnery, which nowadays we would consider to be a life of seclusion restriction and some rigidity. But in the Middle Ages, it was an opportunity for many women to seek companionship, security, and education. Noble women, queens and noble women, were often patrons of medieval nunneries in their own right, funding capital projects, even founding new houses, and certainly by their presence, their prestige, and their support, giving greater importance to religious houses than they might otherwise have had. A further point is in relation to the appointments of heads of religious houses. Certainly from the beginning of the 13th century, if not before, canon law protected the right of free election. That meant that the nuns in the nunnery and the monks in the monastery were supposed to elect their own head without outside interference. We often hear of stories where there was outside interference, but on the whole, the evidence of bishops' registers of the 13th century suggests that the rights were carefully upheld and safeguarded. So it's an unexpected place in which we find that women have the power of voting and that it is checked and that it is upheld. So they choose their own leader of the sisterhood. Although the medieval laws of inheritance in England certainly favoured men, the eldest son of the family would inherit by far the greatest part of the estate. But the laws did not discount women. If there were no son, then the estates would go to a daughter. If there were more than one daughter, then the inheritance would be shared equally between them. So arguably, if you were a younger daughter, you actually had a better chance of inheriting estates than a younger son did. So much for their ability to inherit. In addition, married women were entitled, after the death of their husband, to hold 1/3 of his estates as their dower for the rest of their lives. And this leads me on to telling you a little bit about my research, which has recently been about the patronage of churches in medieval East Anglia in the first part of the 14th century. What I've been able to establish is the amount of ecclesiastical patronage in the hands of women in that period. What do I mean by ecclesiastical patronage? When a rector of a parish church was appointed, it was the patron of the living who told the bishop who he wanted or she wanted the next rector of the parish church to be. The rector of a parish church was a figure of considerable importance in the parish community. He had responsibility for care of souls and for the pastoral provision of the local people. He was entitled to the tithes, that is, 1/10 of everybody's produce from their agricultural labours. So the rector of a parish church was a person of influence and importance locally. What my research has shown is that of over 1,000 presentations by members of the laity to church livings in East Anglia in the first quarter of the 14th century, 175 presentations, or over 16%, were made by women. Now, I know that 16% is not the same as 50%, and I'm not arguing that the amount of church patronage in the control of women was equal to that of men. But over 16% is not an inconsiderable proportion either. And it becomes the more significant when we think that the amount of ecclesiastical patronage has a relationship with real estate as well. These powers of presenting to churches were based on the ownership of real property. So, as a rough equivalence, we can say that women controlled over 16% of the property owned by the laity in 14th century East Anglia. That meant that a considerable proportion of the clergy owed their position to female appointment and influence. We know too that women, when they exercised these rights, did so promptly, sought to do so in an informed manner, and were prepared very determinedly to defend their rights in the royal court when they needed to do so. Finally, rather lower down the social scale, we find that women are often their husband's companions in his craftsman's workshop, gaining skills and experience which enabled them to carry on the trade after their husband had died. That depended on the bylaws of the town or borough in which they lived, but nevertheless we find that many women did do so. Although women can't make a will when they're married, they're named as their husband's executors. So that in itself suggests that their husbands believed them to be knowledgeable about their affairs and that they trusted their wives to carry out their wishes. There is no way in which you can argue that women in the Middle Ages had an equal role with men, or that they exercised public power and authority in proportion to their numbers. But in this very brief talk, I hope I've shown that just by looking at some of the less glamorous records, and particularly the administrative records of church and state, it's possible to discern the role of women and to hear their voice, and perhaps even to see that they had a very distinctive role to play.